Welcome everyone to Crash Course Apologetics, where I summarize the work of Christian scholars in animated videos and interviews. Tonight, we have a very interesting discussion about evidentially compelling religious experiences, things of a miraculous nature. We'll talk about some NDEs, things like that. So, and specifically, we'll talk about the implications of testimony to those kinds of events, especially widespread testimony to those kinds of events. So I'm very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Travis Dumsday, and I will bring him into the chat now. Hello, Dr. Dumsday. Everyone can see you.
Hi, Jordan.
So tonight we're going to talk about your paper titled, I have it pulled up so I get the title right. Evidentially compelling, let me get back to the first page, I was at the end. Evidentially compelling religious experiences and the moral status of naturalism. Now, I posted on my Facebook page that if anyone wanted to access that paper, they could shoot a message to me. People, I'm sure, could also email you and get access if they can't find it online. But were you able to upload it to Phil Papers?
I think it got uploaded.
Oh, okay, great.
Hopefully that went through.
Okay, then even better. So what I'll do for those viewers that are interested in reading the paper and exploring it in more depth, I'll put a link to the paper on Phil Papers, and then you can just click and get immediate access. All right, well, I will give you just a minute or less, you don't have to take up a whole minute, to just give us a little bit of your background and maybe how you got interested in philosophy and specifically the topic of religious experiences. How'd you find your way into this territory?
Sure. Well, I got into philosophy pretty early on. I actually started to become kind of obsessed with it in high school, and so that just sort of continued into my undergrad education, and then I went into the field for graduate school and finished my PhD in 2010 at the University of Calgary in northwestern Canada. In terms of working on religious experiences specifically, I've been interested in those likewise for quite a long time, partly from my own experience in sort of early life. And then when I got into academic philosophy, I became aware that there was this extensive scholarly literature on religious experiences and paranormal experiences and their evidential implications, what they really mean for how we should view the world. And so, in fact, some of my earliest publications were on this topic. I think one of my first papers was a 2008 article on purported neuroscientific explanations for certain kinds of religious experience. And it's never been my main field of study, but I've kind of continued with the topic on and off ever since.
Neat. Okay. Well, I've tried my best to hit the highlights of the paper, and I essentially see it breaking it down into 4 parts. So tonight's discussion, I'm going to try and structure it around 4 steps. So in the very first part, we're going to just define some terms that will be used throughout the rest of this discussion. So it's important that we lay those out so that you know exactly what we mean when we use them later. So that's step 1, to just define the terms. Step 2 is going to be to identify some cases of religious experiences, the specific type that you're calling evidentially compelling religious experiences. So we're going to lay out a few cases like that. And then step 3 is you have an argument that uses that data, the evidentially compelling religious experiences. You have an argument that serves as a kind of critique of what you'll call settled naturalism. It forms a dilemma for the settled naturalists. So we're going to lay out that argument. That's step 3. And then in step 4, we're going to consider some objections to that argument. So that's the general structure for the viewers to kind of get a sense of what the flow is going to be like. We'll define terms, lay out cases, present the argument, and then consider objections to it. Those are the 4 steps. All right. So let's first define a couple. I think there are like 2 main terms that we just have to break down, get some distinctions. So the first is with respect to the term religious experience. So can you offer a definition or a helpful distinction there?
Sure. Well, just to put it in a really broad context first, so in ordinary language, people might use the phrase religious experience in all kinds of ways. So in ordinary language, we might think of someone going to church and getting a real emotional uplift from the praise music, and afterwards the person might refer to that as a religious experience, right? They got a real boost from worship that day, and they refer to it as a religious experience. That's one thing it might mean. There's a whole variety of contexts of that kind, facetious contexts, like you eat a really fantastic burrito and you tell people that was a religious experience. So there's all kinds of contexts that we might be using this language in, but the language I'm referring to is something pretty specific, where a religious experience is an experience in which the individual, the experiencer, takes herself to be in contact with some kind of non-natural or supernatural reality or entity. So, for example, if the person's in church and they feel the presence of an unseen person, which they take to be a supernatural entity, that would be an example of the kinds of thing we're talking about in this context when we're talking about religious experience. Or seeing a vision of the Virgin Mary, hearing a voice during prayer, something like that. Those would all be kind of textbook paradigm cases of the sorts of things we're referring to when we're referring to religious experience.
Okay. And you make this distinction in the paper between a religious experience that leaves open the possibility of supernatural origin versus a religious experience that seems to imply a supernatural origin. Do you want to elaborate on that at all, or we can move on to the next term if you want?
No, this is good. So the case, the sort of hypothetical example I give, the hypothetical contrast I give in the paper to try to illustrate this distinction between what you might call, evidentially dubious versus evidentially compelling religious experiences. So an example of the first kind, sort of an evidentially dubious religious experience, might be one of those cases I was just referring to. So let's say you're at prayer, and during prayer you hear this voice, which you take to be not your own voice, not something internally generated. You experience it as an externally sourced event. You hear this voice that says something like, God loves you, or all will be well, something to comfort you in the midst of your prayer. Now, to the person who has that experience, that might seem extremely dramatic, life-changing even for some people when they have experiences like this. But when that person, if that person then tells someone else of her experience, the reactions might vary quite widely. If she tells this to someone who is a pretty convinced naturalist, right, someone who does not believe in the supernatural, someone who thinks that all reality is physical reality, a person told about this experience of hearing a comforting voice during prayer is liable to dismiss that as being something that can be explained using purely naturalistic methods, right? That maybe that was an internally generated hallucination. Not necessarily the person's mentally ill. Maybe it's just internally generated by stress or neurological processes we don't fully understand at the moment. Right? So if someone has a religious experience of that kind, I don't mean to sound dismissive of that kind of religious experience. I'm not. But when I refer to it as evidentially dubious, what I just mean is an experience of the sort which a naturalist is not going to be challenged by, right? A naturalist can hear a report of an experience like this and say, well, look, of course I believe the person's telling the truth, and I don't necessarily think the person's mentally ill, but there's a whole raft of perfectly good naturalistic explanations potentially on the table that we could use to account for what this person experienced.
Yeah, and that's the key part there, that there's the naturalists would have many potential explanations for that kind of religious experience.
Right. And so the contrast, so if that's the kind of thing I'm referring to when I'm talking about an evidentially dubious religious experience, the contrast, an evidentially compelling religious experience would be something more like this. So the example I use in the paper works like this. Once again, you've got a woman in prayer, and once again she hears a voice. This time the voice says, a bullet is about to come through the wall, dodge to the left or you're going to be killed. Right, so the person hears this voice, it doesn't know what to think, but it's sort of in panic, dodges to the left, and sure enough, a second or two later, a bullet comes through the wall and hits the wall right behind her, right, where if she hadn't moved, she would have been killed. Now, when someone has an experience like that, this kind of these sort of rescue experiences are actually quite widely reported. When someone has an experience like this, this is liable to seem even more impressive or dramatic to the person who has the experience. And so when she reports that experience to someone else, a naturalist, right, someone who believes that they're again, the only kind of reality is physical reality, someone who believes in what's sometimes called physicalism or materialism. Those are just synonyms for naturalism. Someone who hears that report is going to be challenged by it. Right? Because if this person is telling the truth, if this experience actually occurred as she is reporting it, that seems incompatible with naturalism. Right? That experience, at least at first glance, if it actually happened, seems to imply the falsity, the plausible falsity of naturalism. Right? It seems to demand a supernatural explanation. Again, so that's the sort of thing I mean when I'm talking about an evidentially compelling religious experience. Now, again, there might be some initial ways you might try to get around.
Oh, wait, just a minute.
So
you cut out for...
The naturalist might try to say, well, look, maybe the person's not lying, and maybe she's not Sure.
You cut out for just maybe the past sentence, so you can just repeat the last sentence you were saying.
Sorry. So yeah, the naturalist, when faced with this report, might initially say, well, assuming the person's not lying, not crazy, hasn't somehow manufactured a false memory, right? Standard sorts of explanations. The naturalist might try to dismiss this as a truly 1 in a million coincidence, right? Sometimes people do hear voices. Occasionally those voices make predictions. Usually those predictions are false. But, one time in a million, maybe they come out true. And maybe this is one of those unbelievably improbable sorts of experiences. Now, that might be true, but if you're looking for an uncontroversial example of an evidentially compelling religious experience, you can just tweak the case a little bit, right? So you might, for instance, adjust the case I just gave and say, well, let's say, when the disembodied voice gives the warning about the bullet coming through the wall, the voice says, well, and a bullet from a .357 Magnum is going to come through the wall in 3 seconds, dodge to the left, right? And say, when the police come to the house later on and dig the bullet out of the wall, turns out it's a bullet from a .357 Magnum, right? So you can tweak these cases to sort of render even less probable the idea that it could just be a massive coincidence. So anyway, the idea is just that when you've got what seems to be an evidentially compelling religious experience, that's an experience of a sort that seems to challenge the truth of naturalism in a way that other sorts of religious experiences may not.
Gotcha. Okay, so just to try and summarize that as briefly as I can, when we are, well, I say we, in the paper, you are defining an evidentially compelling religious experience as the type of religious experience that implies the falsity of naturalism, or at least implies a supernatural origin. You might take those as just the same kind of claim. So that's what you're meaning when you talk about an evidentially compelling religious experience. It's not like these experiences can just easily be explained by many, many alternative options that the naturalist has open to them. They're of a nature that if they occur, then naturalism seems to be false and there seems to be some kind of supernatural origin to it. Right?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. All right. So hopefully that's clear what we mean by evidentially compelling religious experience. Another absolutely essential term that we need to carefully define is naturalism. So you use this a lot throughout the paper. You talk about metaphysical naturalism, settled naturalist or settled naturalism, and attentive naturalism. So why don't you just explain what you mean by those terms so that as we use them, people will be clear?
Sure. Well, naturalism, sometimes the term materialism or physicalism is used as a synonym. Naturalism is basically the claim that the only kind of reality is physical reality. And so at minimum, the naturalist is claiming that there are no supernatural entities, so no angels, no gods, no spirits, nothing beyond the physical realm. Now, naturalism can be adopted in various ways. So you might have someone who believes in naturalism, but isn't completely sure about it, right? There are degrees of strength of belief, right? And so you can imagine someone being a tentative naturalist, right? Someone who is inclined to affirm naturalism, but is open to the idea, nevertheless, that it could be false, right? Is open to looking at evidence, for the contrary point of view. So that would be what I would mean by a tentative naturalist. By contrast, a settled naturalist would be someone who is so convinced of the truth of naturalism that she feels no real need to look into the evidence any further, right? She is a very strong proponent of naturalism, does not think that she needs to inquire any further into it, and so is liable to be more dismissive of claims to evidence for the supernatural.
Gotcha. And did you mention tentative naturalism?
Yeah, so the contrast there would be the contrast between tentative naturalism versus settled naturalism. But also, one other sort of conceptual dividing line I mentioned in the paper is that, within settled naturalism, there's a further division I talk about that I probably should have given a label to. So in other work I've done on this, I mention another term that I may as well introduce, the notion of a devout naturalist, right? Where a devout naturalist is sort of a settled naturalist taken up a notch, right? Where a devout naturalist thinks that, so a devout naturalist is not only convinced that naturalism is true, but thinks that belief in supernatural entities is utterly absurd, right? So someone who thinks that the supernatural is not just false, not just unreal, but sort of crazy or something that would be absurd to believe in. So if you're thinking of an example of someone that might count as a devout naturalist, some of your viewers might be familiar with Richard Dawkins. I think Richard Dawkins would be a plausible example of someone who would count as a devout naturalist, right? Dawkins seems to think that belief in God is tantamount to belief in the flying spaghetti monster, or belief in the human soul is as absurd as belief in leprechauns. And so that kind of uber settled naturalist is also something I talk about at various points in the paper.
Okay. I saw a comment that was kind of anticipating where we were going, so I'll mention it here. As you were describing those, an example of what we might mean by an evidentially compelling religious experience, the YouTube name is Jekyll and Hyde. He said, "Atheist here." He, talking about you, Dr. Dumsday, quickly rushed past the most probable explanation, either intentional deceit or a story that is remembered incorrectly and expanded in retelling. I mentioned that comment just to say that Jekyll and Hyde, we're heading that way. We're going to be definitely discussing that, so hang tight.
That's a great YouTube name. I love that novel.
Okay, well, now that we've defined the two big terms, which was religious experiences, the exact type that we're talking about, and naturalism, I think that what we say from here will be clear to the viewers. So that completes the first step, those defining terms. Now let's go to the second step, which was laying out some cases of evidentially compelling religious experiences. So why don't you go ahead and begin summarizing those for us. In the paper, you lay out 6. We spoke a couple days ago, and you said that you had many more that you could have included, but due to just word limits, you weren't able to include them. So whatever cases you want to discuss, go for it.
Sure. Well, so in the paper, I really just quote the cases directly from the original primary sources. But in the interest of time, I'll try to just give the kind of bare bones outline of what's going on in these cases. So the first case I talk about is published originally in, I think it was the 2001 volume of one of the world's leading medical journals called The Lancet. And this Lancet article is dealing with near-death experiences. So I expect many of your viewers will know what basically what a near-death experience is. But essentially, a near-death experience, or NDE, is when someone has a cardiac arrest, right? So it is clinically dead. And then after revival, reports that they experienced something during this period of clinical death. Very often, the experience of sort of their consciousness floating outside their body, witnessing what's happening in the operating room or the ER or whatever. Sometimes going then through a tunnel, seeing a bright light, encountering dead loved ones, that kind of thing. So that's the basic phenomenon of a near-death experience, which is actually, in the literature on religious experiences, near-death experiences go way, way back. Plato talks about examples of near-death experiences. You see them in ancient literature, but they didn't really become common or very widely known until CPR became, widely used and sort of perfected in the 1960s. So since the 1960s, there's been this explosion of cases of near-death experiences and a burgeoning literature on the topic. So anyway, that's just a bit of background for readers who might not have been familiar with the label. Anyway, going back to this journal article in The Lancet. So the article is talking about case studies of near-death experiences in, I believe it's primarily cardiac wards. And the authors relate a near-death experience that was reported to them by a nurse who was working in one of the ICUs of this hospital. And the nurse reported a case of a patient of hers who had been clinically dead for, I believe, an extended period. I'd have to look up the case again to see the specifics. But anyway, this older gentleman had been clinically dead. They managed to revive him. After he was revived and was recovering in the ICU, he pointed out this nurse and said, hey, you know where my dentures are. And at first she was kind of shocked to hear this because, in fact, she was the woman who, while he was clinically dead, as they were getting ready to do the full revival procedure, she had to take out his dentures and put them on some table in the operating room.
I think they call it a crash cart.
Yes, I think that's the term that was used. Thank you. Yeah. So when he woke up, he was able to identify this particular nurse as knowing where his dentures would be because this was the woman who had taken them out. And sure enough, she was. And she emphasized in her report to the journal article authors that this man was clinically dead when this happened. And as it turns out, he went on to this patient went on to report that he knew this because he was watching the revival process from outside of his body. He was sort of existed as a discarnate consciousness during the procedure when they were trying to revive him, and was able to accurately report not just that detail, but other details as well regarding what had gone on during the procedure. So this nurse was, quite impressed by this afterwards. Anyway, so that's one example I talk about in the paper. I give another quite similar example from
Melvin Morse.
Yes, thank you, Melvin Morse. He's a pediatrician who also studies near-death experiences. And he reported, again, quite a dramatic experience of this kind when he had revived a 7-year-old girl who had drowned.
Yeah, Katie.
Yeah, and so Katie also managed to report quite stunningly accurate details of what had gone on during her revival when she was not just clinically dead, but had severe brain swelling, right? So she was profoundly comatose at the time this revival was undergoing, and yet she was able to accurately identify, which physicians had been in the room, when they had entered vis-a-vis each other, the kind of intubation they had been using, nasal intubation rather than oral intubation. So she knew quite, specific details of what had gone on, which again had really struck this pediatrician, Melvin Morse, quite profoundly. And, he went on to, that was the first near-death experience he had encountered in his practice as a medical doctor, and it sort of changed his life. And he went on to devote quite a lot of his later work to the topic in addition to his medical practice.
Yeah. Katie, that case is really interesting. I'm pretty sure this is accurate. It's been a while since I've reviewed. I've told Andrew Moon that a few years ago I got super into looking at near-death experiences, and so I started collecting like my own kind of tally of all these experiences. And I remember reading that one. I'm pretty sure it was Katie that knew some details of what her family was doing back home, that her family lived miles away, and she knew like what song came on the radio, I think, at her house as her mother was there, and some details like that as well. But I don't want to get too hung up on the details right now. You can continue. So those are two near-death experience cases that you discuss in the paper.
Yeah, so to turn to a different kind of example, there was I talk about a case from a Christian, a medical doctor. I believe his name was John White, from one of. He was a psychiatrist who also wrote a number of works on sort of popular works on theology, and he talks about a dramatic healing he witnessed when he was on, I believe it was a medical missions trip to. I think it was Malaysia or Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to look it up. But White talks about this young girl, this 2-year-old toddler, who was suffering from quite a severe skin ailment. She had all kinds of open sores in various parts of her body that were sort of seeping. The poor girl was in pretty rough shape. And he and his wife, and they were there together with this girl's parents. And they managed to get the girl calmed down. And he lay hands on this girl, and she immediately sort of fell asleep. She sort of conked out. And so this physician and his wife and were praying for this toddler. And before their eyes, these seeping sores all over her skin started to evaporate and dry up, and were just almost instantaneously healed as this girl slept. And he said he was, in his writing about this, he sort of emphasizes that there's no real way to adequately communicate the emotional force of this when you see something like this with your own eyes. And so this is coming from a medical doctor who was very confident there was no natural way to explain what was going on. There's just no natural way for a medical problem of that sort to heal that quickly, especially in response to prayer. So he was quite struck by that, and I consider that to be an example of an evidentially compelling experience. I'll just give one more example from, again, I think I go through about a half dozen in the paper. I'll just talk about one more, because it sort of fits in with that bullet through the wall example I gave you earlier. So this case is from a book by a British anthropologist, Emma Heathcote James. She did her doctorate in cultural anthropology on the topic of contemporary experiences with angels. So as part of her dissertation work in the UK, I think at the University of Birmingham, she solicited reports of what people felt to be, direct experiences with angels. And initially, when she was first conducting the work, she thought that she'd have a really hard time finding cases to work with, given that this is sort of initially she thought of this as sort of a kind of medieval sort of phenomenon. Wasn't really expecting very much in the way of contemporary reports, but once her project sort of became more widely known, she was inundated. She ended up getting more than 800 case studies that people wrote into her about. Now, some of those case studies were sort of, I guess what you'd think of as a stereotypical angel encounter, something out of the Bible, right? Seeing a winged, glowing being. Others were more subtle, but where the people still interpreted them as encounters with angels. And one of them falls under a class of sort of supernatural rescue experiences. So this case was from a fellow named Paul Dunwell. And Dunwell reported that he was out motorcycling one night in sort of the British countryside, and he was going around a corner, a fairly sharp corner. I should note something important first. So he's speeding down this English country road. He speeds past a car, and then he goes around a sharp corner, loses control. The bike turns over, and his motorcycle is now collapsed in the middle of the road. And he knows this car is soon going to be coming around the corner at fairly high speed, and so he's really concerned this car is going to crash into his motorcycle, and it could lead to a fairly severe accident. So he's desperately trying to to pull his motorcycle out from the middle of the road, before the car comes around the corner and, given the blind spot, would run right into it. Then he says, though, that he was shocked when, as he's desperately trying to pull his bike out of the way, this car very slowly, at a snail's pace, comes around the corner with its high beams turned on. And when the driver then pulls up beside the motorcycle and says to Dunwell, "You're never going to believe this, but as I was driving, all of a sudden, I heard this voice say that there's a crash ahead. You've got to slow down so that you don't hit this person in the middle of the road." And he said that he obeyed the voice, and so he avoided what could have been quite a major accident. So that's an example of what's actually quite a surprisingly common phenomenon of these sort of seemingly supernatural rescue events. And whole books have been written about that particular kind of what I would term an evidentially compelling religious experience.
All right. So I think that covered 1, 2, 3, 4 of the cases. You mentioned 2 more in the paper. I don't know if you want to say those here, or, I mean, those 4 I think are good enough to give people an idea.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I'll maybe let, if readers want to see the other 2, of course, they're happy to download the paper.
Yeah, okay, very good. All right, so that completes step 2, where we describe some cases. Now, I imagine before we go to step 3, where we lay out the argument that you build from these cases. So it's not like I want to clarify something, and you can as well. It's not like you just cite these cases and say, there, naturalism's false. It's not like you do that. What you do is you actually construct an argument from these cases. And what I think is very interesting is that you don't assume that these cases are true. Like, your argument doesn't have to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's not the case that in order for your argument to work, the cases you describe have to be true. It seems like your argument will work so long as, if it's a conditional statement, if these kinds of events were true, then some things follow. Am I correct in saying that?
Pretty much, yes. So the idea is the argument's meant to follow along just on the notion that provided people report experiences of this kind that could rightly be classified as evidentially compelling religious experiences, that's actually going to have some surprising implications for the moral status of naturalism, at least for a certain kind of naturalist.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's go ahead and move to step 3 then, which is the actual argument. And you just, before we lay it out, you said something very important, and I want you to identify or clear this up. You said this argument is for a particular type of naturalist, not just any and every naturalist. So what particular type do you think this argument will apply to?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that there is this division I made between tentative naturalists versus settled naturalists. And then within that class of settled naturalists, I made kind of a further division between, settled naturalists versus sort of uber or devout naturalists, mm-hmm. right? So the argument is targeted very specifically not at tentative naturalists and not at devout naturalists, but very specifically at settled naturalists, right? People who would say that, people who are quite thoroughly convinced of the truth of naturalism, but who are not devout naturalist, right? They would not dismiss the supernatural as on the level of leprechauns or something that we would see as utterly absurd, right? And there were settled naturalists who are quite convinced of the truth of naturalism. They don't feel any need to revisit the evidence one way or another. But they don't necessarily think that the supernatural is something crazy or absurd.
Okay.
So
All
the
right.
argument, so I say that just to emphasize that the argument will have no truck for a devout naturalist, right? Richard Dawkins, folks who hold his kind of view about that the supernatural is simply absurd, they will be rationally unfazed by the line of reasoning I try to pursue here.
Okay. So to help the audience, I've made a slide. There are a lot of words on the slide because this argument has actually more than 7 steps, but it was so much to fit on here that I only put the 7 steps, and the actual dilemma itself that results at the end, I'm just going to let you, Dr. Dumsday, state that. I can read it from the paper if you want that dilemma, but I'll at least show the steps that get us to the dilemma for the settled naturalist, and then that way people can follow along. Sound good?
Yeah, good.
Okay, so I'm going to read these out. We talked about this ahead of time, and I'll try to go slow, but after I read them out, I'll have Dr. Dumsday kind of offer reasons to think that these premises are plausibly true. So let's begin. All right, so here's the main argument. Step 1, or premise 1. If most settled naturalists view metaphysical non-naturalism as neither absurd nor dismissible with certainty, then for them, the mere claim to an evidentially compelling religious experience is not, by itself, adequate evidence of deception, even where deception is the only rationally available naturalistic explanation. So that's step 1. Did you want? I'll do this before I go through all the steps. If you want to clarify or simplify anything, just chime in, Dr. Dumsday. Okay.
Sure.
So step 2, if for them, talking about settled naturalists, if for them the mere claim to an evidentially compelling religious experience is not by itself adequate evidence of deception, even where deception is the only rationally available naturalistic explanation, then it is wrong for them to attribute deception to the person claiming an evidentially compelling religious experience without further adequate evidence of deception. Premise 3. Therefore, if most settled naturalists view metaphysical non-naturalism as neither absurd nor dismissible with certainty, I meant to only put 1 then it is wrong for them to attribute deception to the person claiming an evidentially compelling religious experience without further adequate evidence of deception. Now that's kind of the first stage of your argument. You're just, I interpret you as saying, hey, for the settled naturalist, who is very confident in their naturalism, but they're not this devout type that's thinking it's absolutely impossible for theism to be true, or something like that. For that type of naturalist, it's wrong for them to just immediately jump to it's deception. This person telling this case, they're just lying without actually investigating it to see if it actually seems like there is good evidence of deception. That's what I interpret you to be saying.
Right. Yeah. That the settled naturalist, someone who again, who is pretty convinced of naturalism, but they don't hold it with absolute rigid certainty. They don't think that the supernatural is just a crazy notion to believe in. When they're presented with an evidentially compelling religious experience, I think, that it would be problematic to automatically conclude the person making this report must be lying, right? Because, they're not saying something that they would think is absolutely crazy or something that could be immediately dismissed.
Okay.
As the devout naturalist would be able to say.
Mm-hmm. All right, so kind of moving to the second stage of the argument now, the next part. Premise 4, most settled naturalists view metaphysical non-naturalism as neither absurd nor dismissible with certainty. Premise 5, therefore, which this is one of the conclusions that follows, but therefore it is wrong for them, talking about the settled naturalists, to attribute deception to the person claiming an evidentially compelling religious experience without further adequate evidence of deception. And then premise 6, the settled naturalist who is aware of the relevant facts about evidentially compelling religious experiences can only retain settled naturalism by either acting against the moral structure just laid out or by ignoring the previous premise altogether. And so 7 says this entails a dilemma. And this is where I can let you state the dilemma. I'll leave it up to you. Let me bring you back in. Either you can lay out the dilemma now, or if you want to try and defend those premises leading to it and then lay out the dilemma, what do you think's best?
Maybe I'll just briefly lay out the dilemma.
Okay.
So the idea is basically that the settled naturalist, when faced with these evidentially compelling, a report of an evidentially compelling religious experience, for most settled naturalists, like those who are settled but not devout, they're going to be faced with a dilemma in the following sense, that they're either going to have to dismiss the report as being deceptive, right? In other words, say that, this, for instance, this Christian medical doctor who witnessed this healing of the skin condition, because that seems to be miraculous, you can just say, well, he must be lying. That's one option, right? The other option is to say, well, don't know whether he's lying or not. We can just leave it open and sort of suspend judgment on what's going on here. So you might attribute deception, or you might say, well, rather than accuse the person of deception, let's just suspend judgment. I think both of those are problematic. If you accuse them of deception, that's morally problematic, right? It's wrong to accuse people of lying when you don't have adequate evidence to warrant an accusation of deception. Right? This sort of violates the golden rule, right? Nobody likes to be accused of deception, so we shouldn't accuse others of deception unless we have good grounds of doing so. And most settled naturalists, even if they're pretty convinced of their naturalism, they're not 100% sure about it, right? They don't think that the supernatural is absurd. And so they can't be totally sure that someone making that report must be lying. And so I think it would be wrong for them to make the accusation of deception because they don't have adequate evidence of deception. On the other hand, if they try to suspend judgment and just say, well, look, I don't know if the person's lying, I don't know if the report's real, I don't know what to think, let's just leave it aside for now as a sort of peculiar anomaly, we'll suspend judgment on what really happened. That seems to be irrational because it seems inconsistent with a really settled naturalism. If you're going to suspend judgment, that seems more consistent with tentative naturalism. Right? That seems more consistent with holding naturalism, perhaps still holding it to be true, but holding it with a lesser degree of confidence, a degree of confidence appropriate to a tentative naturalist rather than a settled naturalist.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the basic dilemma, that for most settled naturalists, if they're faced with a report of an evidentially compelling religious experience that does not seem to have other sorts of naturalistic explanations, right? The person doesn't seem to be crazy, doesn't seem a good candidate for a manufactured memory or something like this, where deception seems the only other naturalistic explanation. In a case like that, then we get this dilemma. Either they have to accuse the person of deception or suspend judgment. The first horn of that dilemma is immoral. It's wrong to accuse people of deception without adequate grounds. The second horn of the dilemma is irrational, right? It's irrational to suspend judgment on the issue while still claiming to be a settled naturalist, because in fact that's not consistent with settled naturalism. It should instead drive the person towards tentative naturalism.
Very well said. So I hope that's clear to the viewers. Please, if you all want clarification about the dilemma, go ahead and say so in the live chat. But it felt very clear to me what you're arguing there. So here's where we're at, Dr. Dumsday, in terms of time. We're at 51 minutes. So I'll let you decide how we want to spend the remaining time. We can try to give reasons in support of those premises that led to that dilemma, or we can turn to objections to the argument. What do you think?
Well, I think I've already touched on a couple of the reasons regarding the dilemma. So the notion that we do have this moral obligation to not assume deception in the absence of an adequate ground. So that's part of the moral justification for that aspect of the argument. And moreover, just one other quick point of justification that I mentioned in the paper. So again, the best sorts of cases for use in this argument, the best sort of cases to have in the back of our minds when we're working through the argument, is cases where deception really does appear to be the only out, right? Where there don't seem to be other plausible naturalistic accounts of what went on. And I think in all the cases I provide in the paper, that's plausibly the case, right? Where deception really is the only way to go for what's going on there, right? So in the case of that first near-death experience we talked about, right, with the nurse and the dentures, really there's no good scientific explanation for what happened there. There's no good naturalistic explanation for what happened there other than the nurse is lying, right? She just made up the report. And I think much the same can be said for the other cases I go over there. And so cases of that sort, I think, are the best candidates to employ when we're thinking through this argument.
Yeah, and you talk about, which this may come up in some of the objections. I think it does come up in one of those objections that we're going to talk about. But you talk about, naturalistic explanations like, oh, well, the person they're misremembering what's happening, and then they, over time they add details, maybe unconsciously, and the story gets embellished, something like that. We're not talking about cases. We're talking about cases that are of a nature where the people, it's not plausible to ascribe to the people involved that kind of thing is happening, or the people hallucinated. They have a mental illness. Like explanations like these, we're picking particular cases to where those kinds of explanations don't apply, and these cases. Right. These cases are of a nature that, from a naturalistic perspective, deception is the only way to explain that report. This individual is lying. That's the one explanation. So those are the kinds of cases that we're talking about. In the case, just think of that doctor looking at this 2-year-old girl with all those things. He prays, and instantaneously all those sores recede. That kind of thing. It seems like in that case, the naturalist is going to have to say that was deception. He's lying. Okay, so then those are the three steps we've taken so far. We defined our terms, gave cases, and then laid out the argument for this dilemma. Now we want to talk about objections to the argument. And this will finish out the discussion here. You give 6 objections in the paper, and we'll try our best to hit these. Some of them may overlap, so feel free to combine them if you want. But go ahead and talk about this first objection. The person that says, maybe it is immoral to accuse them of deception, but that just seems rational to say, in this case, to say that they're lying.
Yeah. So in that objection, the naturalist, as you say, might reply by saying that, well, sometimes the demands of morality come into conflict with other sorts of rational demands. In this case, the demand for truth, right? And so if a settled naturalist believes that he or she has exceptionally good rational reasons for affirming the truth of naturalism, this person might say, well, look, in the face of those other reasons, accusing this person of deception, maybe it really is morally problematic, but moral reasons aren't the only kind of reasons. And in this case, the demands of truth sort of trump or outweigh the demands of morality. And my response to that in the paper is to deny that last claim, right? The claim that other sorts of demands could override moral demands. Now, at least that's the first response I give to this objection, right? So in ethics, there's actually quite a big debate over this issue of what is the status of moral reasons over and against other kinds of reasons, prudential reasons or rational reasons or other things like this. Must it always be the case that moral demands outweigh other kinds of demands? And in the paper, I just sort of unapologetically say, in this debate, I fall on the side of those who say that moral reasons are overriding. Right? If you have a moral obligation to do something or to refrain from doing something, that's kind of the end of the discussion. It doesn't matter what other sorts of prudential or rational or aesthetic reasons you might have that compete with that moral reason. Morality wins out. That's kind of just the nature of morality. It sort of trumps other kinds of demands. That's my first reply. And it is kind of a risky reply because this is an active debate in ethics. There are good arguments on both sides of this, but that's the way I go. The sort of subsidiary reply I give is that in this case, there isn't actually a conflict here between moral reasons and sort of the demands of truth-seeking. Right? Because, again, what we're dealing with here are settled naturalists, not devout naturalists. That's who the argument is aimed at. And the settled naturalist has to allow some room, however slim, for the possibility of the supernatural, right? Because they're not dismissing it as crazy or absurd. So that being the case, sort of the settled naturalist who was made to take seriously a report of an evidentially compelling religious experience, who is compelled to take it seriously and not dismiss it as a pack of lies, that could actually be truth conducive, right? Because for all they know, the supernatural could be real, however small the chance might be. And so taking these reports seriously, looking into them in detail, not simply dismissing them automatically as lies, that could actually be leading towards the truth instead of away from it. So I think that, so it's a twofold response to this initial objection, where the first response is to challenge the claim that moral reasons could ever be overridden by other sorts of demands. And the second reply is to dispute the idea that here morality really is in conflict with truth-seeking.
Okay. Let's go ahead and discuss the second objection. So this objection essentially says, to call someone that, in some of these cases, we may not even know the person's name. We've never met them. To call them a liar, that may not be immoral, but even if it is, maybe it's just a kind of minor immoral act that I commit. So this doesn't seem all that problematic.
Yeah, my response to that is to some degree to challenge the idea that this would sort of be borderline morally trivial, right? That, again, you've never met this person, so thinking ill of this person who's never going to know about your thoughts, they're never going to care necessarily, what's the great harm? And part of my response to this objection is to say that, well, look, it's wrong to wrong people, even when they don't know it. It's wrong to think ill of people, even if they're never going to know that you are judging them harshly. Why? Well, in part, again, I'm working with this sort of biblical injunction, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. None of us likes people to judge us harshly on inadequate evidence, and so we should treat others the same way, even if it's not going to have any immediate practical consequence. This is just one of the moral demands we're faced with. And again, I think as a subsidiary reply, I'd want to say that once again, the motivation to sort of view those kinds of judgments in a sort of lighthearted fashion would be in part that, well, look, truth is more important in this case than committing some kind of small moral, what's the right word? The technical term, I guess, would be a venial sin, but I'm looking for something less technical. A relatively unimportant moral trespass, right? Mm-hmm. But again, I would want to say that, well, dismissing people who make these reports as liars, even if in doing so we're committing only a minor moral wrong, we also might be obstructing our own search for truth, right? Because again, if we're looking at this from the perspective of a settled naturalist rather than a devout naturalist, well, you should leave some room open for the possibility that this might actually be real. And if you dismiss all the people making these reports as liars, you might be cutting off your ability to acquire a new and important truth.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so those were the first kind of two objections, and there's some overlap there between them. But the third objection here is what you call the expansion problem. And I guess the idea is, hey, Dr. Dumsday, if this argument works, then does that mean that suddenly I need to, before I can think someone's lying, about being abducted by aliens or seeing a flying saucer or experiencing a ghost, if this argument works, then it seems like it would apply in those cases, and so all of a sudden we get this kind of expansion problem where all these other kinds of supernatural experiences, alien abductions, flying saucers, ghosts, all that stuff, suddenly I can't be very settled on those issues. I have to change to tentative on those issues. So that's the objection, I think, anyway.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly it. And my response is in a way to sort of grant the point. So what I say is that, well, so take the example of alien abduction. So if you think that the notion of abduction by space aliens is crazy, right? If you think this is something absurd, well, then it's perfectly legitimate for you to dismiss reports of alien abduction as being, well, I mean, maybe you might dismiss them as being the results of mental illness or hypnotically induced false memories, but in cases where that might not be a feasible explanation, yeah, as a last resort, you might well just say, well, look, given that deception is the only avenue available here, I don't believe in space aliens kidnapping people. Yeah, the person must be lying. That's the only remaining explanation. And given that I think that alien abduction is absurd, I'm okay with that. So, in other words, the expansion issue is not going to be a problem because in cases you think are genuinely absurd, I am perfectly willing to grant it's okay in those cases to dismiss the people making these reports as liars, right? When there's no other naturalistic explanation available for what they're claiming. And in cases where you're not totally dismissive, in cases where you think it's not necessarily absurd, so maybe you think that, well, alien abduction is crazy, but ghosts, well, I'm 90% sure they're not real, but I'm not completely sure. Well, in that case, I'd be happy to say that, well, yeah, if you're faced with what seems like an evidentially compelling ghostly apparition, yeah, you are actually morally obligated. If that's your attitude towards ghosts, right, where you don't think they're completely absurd, right, you're strongly skeptical of them, but you don't think they're crazy. If that's your attitude towards reports of ghosts, in fact, you are obligated not to dismiss reports as deceptive. So I'm happy to sort of just grant that implication. The point I'd want to emphasize, though, is that it's not as disturbing an implication as I think the hypothetical objector might suppose, because I'm not asking them to take seriously anything they think is genuinely absurd.
Okay, so the next objection is goes something like this: hey, if your argument works, then there's something fishy about it, because it seems like suddenly important beliefs become held hostage by liars. And what I mean by that is, one's degree of belief in naturalism is suddenly up to people that are potentially deceiving us. And so there's something fishy going on here. I don't know if I quite captured the objection well, but you can explain it better than me.
Oh, that's got it. Yeah, that if so, the settled naturalist might say something like, "Well, look, I'm 90% sure that naturalism is true, and yeah, I don't want to call these people liars, but I don't, in reality, they probably are liars, and so I shouldn't be held hostage. My beliefs, the degree of confidence in my beliefs should not be held hostage to people who may well be deceiving me. So why should I switch from being a settled naturalist to a merely tentative naturalist simply because there are these reports, even many such reports floating around out there?" Yeah, so my response to this, in part, was to kind of double down on the moral claim I was making earlier, right? That it's genuinely wrong to dismiss people as liars, or to think of someone as a deceiver without adequate evidence. And that's just the demand of morality. And sometimes the demands of morality are awkward and difficult to follow, right? Maybe some of your beliefs will be held hostage to the possibility that people might be deceiving you, right? And the fact that you're not morally able to dismiss them as deceivers. Well, it's kind of tough breaks, right? If morality were easy, everyone would do it. But we really are morally obligated not to judge people harshly in the absence of adequate evidence. And so in the paper, I give a sort of extended quote from a historical philosopher I quite like, Thomas Aquinas, where he states this point quite concisely. Anyway, so it's not a very original kind of reply, but that's sort of the moral point that I stress. And once again, I'd also draw attention to the idea that we really shouldn't think of it as being held hostage to liars, because again, for the settled but not devout naturalist, it could be that taking these reports seriously is truth conducive. Again, it may be that these reports will actually reveal to the settled naturalist some important new truths they were previously unaware of.
Mm-hmm. Okay, 2 objections left, and then we're going to go to questions. So I'll go ahead and say, well, okay, let me make this next objection, and then I'm going to start asking you to type your questions. But I just don't want your comments to get, the viewers, I don't want your comments to get lost in case you hear what Dr. Dumsday is going to say in response to these objections and you want to, make a comment or something. So just hold on to your question for about 5 more minutes while we finish these up. Okay, so the next objection says, look, Dr. Dumsday, every theory, no matter how well supported it is, it can be extremely well supported by the data, but every theory has anomalies, and when that happens, you just kind of have to refrain from, I guess, suspend judgment on those and say, look, these can't easily be integrated into my theory, but my theory is so broadly supported that I'm going to continue sticking with it. So in this case, the settled naturalist might say, look, my theory my settled naturalism is so well supported that I just look at these and I consider them anomalies that I can't easily integrate, but hey, every theory has that, so no biggie. Something along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah, my response to that is to say that in this particular case, that doesn't quite work, because to take that attitude here is basically equivalent to suspending judgment. But in that case, that would just be grasping one horn of the dilemma, right? Where, remember the dilemma, the last portion of the argument was saying that, well, the settled naturalist is then faced with faced with these reports, and in the absence of other good naturalistic explanations, they either have to dismiss them as deceptive or try to suspend judgment. We've already seen why the deception option doesn't work. The option of suspending judgment didn't work because it was inconsistent with settled naturalism, right? It would end up driving the person to a tentative naturalism, rationally. And I think that in this case, when faced with this objection, what the person who points to this sort of anomaly idea is really doing is suspending judgment in a way. Right? What they're saying is, look, I don't know how to explain these reports. I know it's wrong to dismiss them all as lies. I don't really know what to do with them, so for now I'm just going to keep them in my back pocket, and maybe someday a solution will present itself. To me, that sounds too much like suspending judgment, and if you want to do that as a tentative naturalist, that's perfectly consistent. Right? The tentative naturalist, the person who adopts naturalism but with a lesser degree of confidence, that's A-okay. What's problematic is when the settled naturalist tries to do that, because in my eyes, that's inconsistent with a genuinely settled naturalism. a naturalism held with a high degree of confidence.
Okay. All right. This last objection, before I say it, I'll speak to the viewers. So we started out with about 20 viewers live, and I think the number went up and then went down. I think people wanted to hear the cases that you were going to talk about, and then once they heard the cases, it was like, okay, I got what I wanted, and now I'm checking out, which is sad because I feel like all the work is being done on the second half here, this actual argument that puts a settled naturalist in a dilemma. So, but for those still viewing, you are in luck. You get to ask your most challenging questions here for Dr. Dumsday. So go ahead and start typing those in the live chat, and I will be going straight down the list as soon as we finish this last objection. All right. This final objection says, hey, if this argument works, then this seems to be a problem for religious particularists, like Christians. And you may not know what I mean by religious particularism, but people that, think of, let's take Christians, for example, think that Jesus is the only means of salvation. He's the only way one can come to be saved. If you're not, it's only his work that's going to save you. It can't be done through some other religion. So that this objection wants to say, it seems like your argument would target Christians, because how could you be a settled Christian, for instance, if you had to take seriously every claim of an evidentially compelling religious experience with Hindus and Buddhists and all these other religions? So how do you answer that objection?
Yeah, so the first point I make is that I think this objection isn't so much an objection to the argument I'm making in the paper, because the paper's target, again, is a certain sort of settled naturalism, settled naturalists. And so with that in mind, evidentially compelling religious experience, the argument can be run just as well on evidentially compelling religious experiences coming out of any religious tradition or that seem to be religiously neutral. And so given the target I'm working with in this particular paper, I think this objection really doesn't fly, because the argument can be run just as well regardless of what the religious source of the experience is, because they're all religions are going to be incompatible with naturalism. Now, that said, there is, of course, an important question of, if there are evidentially compelling religious experiences coming out of Hindu traditions or Buddhist traditions or neo-paganism or whatever, it does, of course, raise the question for Christians, how should Christians think about such experiences? That is an important question. There is some important literature out there that I think directly speaks to this, some of which I footnote some sources on this in the paper, but it's sort of outside the scope of my pretty narrow target in this particular project. So I kind of just leave it there in the paper.
Okay. Very good. So you might actually get a chance to expand on this, because there is a question about it. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and start asking your questions. So please, if you have a question and you want to ask it, now's the time to type it in the live chat. We're going to go about 15 minutes, if that's okay with you, Dr. Dumsday, maybe 10, 15 minutes to run through these.
Sure.
Okay. So I may be pronouncing the name incorrectly. If so, I apologize. Husaria Tawaris, something like that, said, how do you explain contradictory religious experiences from different religious traditions? Is there any objective standard to judge mystical experiences by?
Yeah, so good. That fits in quite nicely with that last point we were just talking about. Right. So again, that's not something I get into too much in this project, but I can say a little bit about some of my general thoughts on this issue. And there has been quite a bit written on this, of course, both by Christian philosophers and by philosophers working in other religious traditions. Because, of course, in a way, this is a problem for everyone, or at least for everyone, for every religious philosopher working within a particular religious tradition, right? If maybe it's not an issue for philosophers who reject naturalism but sort of don't remain agnostic about any particular religious tradition. So what's to be said about contradictory religious experiences? Well, to just give a few quick thumbnail sketches of what some perspectives on this have suggested. One prominent line of response here is to say that there are no genuinely contradictory religious experiences. There may be contradictory religious doctrines. So the doctrines, the propositional content of Buddhism clearly differs in many important ways from Christianity. They contradict in many of the propositional claims they're making. Nevertheless, you might argue that the actual mystical experiences undergone by the Buddhist or the Christian are not themselves contradictory. There might be ways of describing, understanding the content, the experiential or phenomenological content of these experiences, such that they could actually be comfortably worked into one or another otherwise divergent tradition. So in fact, there's a whole school of thought in philosophy of religion and religious studies more broadly that wants to make this kind of claim that at the experiential level, all religions are essentially consistent. It's sort of at the doctrinal level that they really start to differ. So that's one way to go. And in fact, it's a very commonly pursued way of dealing with this particular problem. It's a way I'm not personally entirely comfortable with, because I incline to the view that there are, in fact, some experiences themselves which do appear to affirm or deny propositional content, particular to one or another religion. And so there can, in fact, be contradictory religious experiences. So what do you do in cases like that? Well, one way to go is to recognize that, of course, we don't evaluate the truth of religions and the truth of religious claims solely on the basis of experience. Right? So if someone's trying to evaluate whether or not a certain school of Buddhism is true, of course, one thing they're going to look at is, the experiences of Buddhists and whether those experiences seem evidentially compelling and why. But they're also going to look at the moral teachings of Buddhism and whether those seem plausible. They're going to look at the wider philosophy to which Buddhism is committed, the epistemological and metaphysical claims made by a certain school of Buddhism, and whether those are independently defensible. In other words, there's a whole wider array of rational means by which we assess the truth claims of religions. Religious experiences is one important way we do so, but it's not the only one, and we really have to do that in a kind of holistic fashion. So that's another kind of strategy we might take. There's a whole bunch of other strategies people might look at when assessing this question. This is actually an issue I've written about myself in some of my other work. If you're interested in this, please feel free to email me, and I can discuss this further or send you some other work I've done on that particular topic.
Great. All right. So the next question here comes from Jekyll and Hyde. He actually wrote a few questions, but so far he's the last one to ask. So we'll ask Jekyll and Hyde's question. He was mentioned earlier. His comment was about deception. So he asked, I'll put it on the screen. If you had to specify a number to denote the confidence in naturalism, what would the number be for the tentative versus the settled naturalist?
That's an interesting question. That's not something I really do in the paper. I think common sense, just thinking about commonsensically how philosophers often tend to think of questions of degrees of belief, I think I'd be inclined to say that you might reasonably say that a tentative naturalist, so if we're thinking of this in like a 1 to 10 scale, where someone holding naturalism to degree 1 holds it very, very tentatively, like they affirm it, but they're really not very confident. Whereas someone who holds it to degree 10, well, that's the devout naturalist who thinks that non-naturalism is just crazy. Right, so where would a tentative naturalist fall on that scale? I'd be inclined to say that anything under degree 5, right, if you hold to naturalism just sort of halfway confident about it, that I think could plausibly be labeled as a tentative naturalist. Anything over sort of halfway confidence, someone who'd want to say that they're like 2/3 confident that naturalism is true, that I think it would probably make more sense to say that person is a settled naturalist. But I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's lots of room for reasonable disagreement about how we want to use the terminology here.
Okay. So the next question from Jekyll and Hyde. Do many of the discussed objections succeed if the naturalist doesn't buy into your moral responses? And I asked Jekyll and Hyde to clarify what he meant by your moral responses. He hasn't said that yet. I think he might mean the reasons that you think attributing deception is immoral. I think that might be what he means, but you may interpret it differently. So I'll repeat the question just for clarity. Do many of the discussed objections succeed if the naturalist doesn't buy into your moral responses?
Sure, I think they would. So, the moral portion of the dilemma, a dilemma only works if all the horns of the dilemma are plausible. Right, so if the moral horn of the dilemma fails, then the argument as a whole fails. And so recall that as the argument plays out, I'm kind of making two moral claims. So one moral claim would be that, again, that it's wrong to attribute deception to someone in the absence of adequate evidence of deception. That's part of the moral claim. The other part of the moral claim is that moral reasons outweigh other kinds of reasons. And so, the objector who wants to sort of home in on the moral horn of the dilemma, I think that would be the way to try to raise additional challenges here, right? Either challenge the claim that it's wrong to attribute deception when we don't have adequate evidence, or that moral reasons always outweigh other kinds of reasons. So, again, I gave some supporting arguments in the paper to try to support, buttress that aspect of the dilemma. But of course, there are other objections that could be raised. I mean, as I mentioned before, there's a large literature, for example, on this question of the overridingness of moral reasons. And certainly there are some very good ethicists who argue that moral reasons are not always trumps. So yeah, that is certainly one way a person could sort of dig in and try to press against the argument. And yeah, I think if that horn of the dilemma falls, the argument is very severely weakened.
Okay. Final question, unless a viewer wants to type one very quickly. Last one from Jekyll and Hyde here. If a settled Christian, when confronted with, say, the evidentiary problem of evil, finds that they don't have a great response, should they downgrade to tentative Christianity?
It would depend. Yeah. So, based on the kind of sort of epistemic criteria that I'm working with in this paper, I guess there it would depend on how significant a challenge they think the evidential problem of evil is to theism. Right? If the person goes in to look at the evidential problem of evil, thinking sort of a priori on prior grounds that the problem of evil is not a significant objection against theism. There may be a variety of reasons why someone might think that. Maybe they're inclined towards a kind of skeptical theist stance where they have prior epistemic commitments that might serve to undermine the problem right off the bat. Anyway, if a person goes into an examination of the evidential problem of evil thinking that the evidential problem of evil is a very serious challenge to theism, and of course theism is a core commitment of Christianity, if that's their starting point, then yes, I think that if after an extended examination of the evidential problem of evil and the many pro and con arguments surrounding the problem, if at the end of that examination they A, think it's a really serious problem for theism, and B, they now think that this very serious problem has no solutions that are at all plausible, then yes, I think that would be adequate to move a settled Christian to a merely tentative Christian.
Gotcha. All right. We did get one more question, and I think it's a good one to close with to prompt the viewers to investigate these things further. Oh, by the way, Jekyll and Hyde, who you answered his questions, he said, thanks for a really interesting discussion. Much appreciated. Will definitely recommend the video and the channel. Thank you so much, Jekyll and Hyde. And I really appreciate the questions as well. And thank you for listening. So I'll finish, though, with my... he's asked me to call him Tim. He has a longer name than that, but I'm going to call him Tim. And Tim asked, Crash Course Apologetics, what are good sources describing evidentially compelling religious experiences? So for those that say, hey, I'd like to acquaint myself with more of these accounts of these evidentially compelling religious experiences, what sources could they get?
Yeah. Well, so in the case studies that I use in the paper, I've sort of cherry-picked out of a variety of different kinds of sources that I've come across over the years. There's no shortage of them, though, in the literature. The difficulty, though, is that the concept of an evidentially compelling religious experience, the sort of specific concept that I'm using in the paper, is kind of one I've developed. Like, it's not widely sort of talked about or recognized in the literature. So in other words, I'm not able to recommend, like, here are 3 books that concentrate solely on evidentially compelling religious experiences, because there just aren't any, or none that would be self-identified in that way, because the concept's just not sort of recognized. However, besides the sources that I actually cite in the paper, some places some kinds of literature where you are liable to run across cases of these ECREs are, first off, the near-death experience literature. You do pretty frequently come across, I think, quite plausible cases of evidentially compelling religious experiences in the near-death experience literature. There's literature on miraculous healings. That literature, of course, is of varying quality. There's more or less reputable books on that topic, but there are some very good books that deal with miraculous healings, and if you're able to find those, you'll certainly come across quite a few examples of experiences of this sort. Also, as I mentioned,
briefly, I'll mention two that come to mind on near-death experiences, specific sources, and maybe you can think of just one specific source if you can off the top of your head for miracles, not just near-death experiences. So the two that come to mind on near-death experiences are the Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism. Includes a chapter from Gary Habermas called Evidential Near-Death Experiences. He lays out, I think, at least a couple dozen in that chapter that are of a highly evidential nature. These people are verifiably brain dead for the appropriate amount of time to be clinically determined dead, and they have experiences and gain knowledge of things that they could not have known were they to simply be their bodies. They know what's going on the other end of a hospital, across the street, miles away. They know about they met maybe a sibling they had, but the sibling was miscarried and their parents never told them about it. Something along these lines. They know about a car accident that's happened and they can describe it in detail. That sort of stuff. Things they can't know. Another book on that is The Self Does Not Die. And this is put together by a team of researchers of near-death experiences, each of them with degrees in the relevant field. And I think they include like 200 cases in that book of evidential near-death experiences. So those are two that come to mind. And then, but miracles, can you think of a book that would be good for that?
Sure. Well, there have been some books that have come out recently by some fairly well-known evangelical authors on miracles that have some very interesting case studies in them. So Eric Metaxas has a book on miracles that came out, I think, just 2 or 3 years ago. And Lee Strobel also has a fairly new book on miracles that he discusses some interesting cases. Probably, though, the best single source would be a massive 2-volume work on miracles by Craig Keener, Keener. Some of your listeners may be familiar with him, some maybe not so much. But Craig Keener's 2-volume book work on miracles is superb and includes literally hundreds of cases, many of which are extensively documented and very, very compelling.
Yeah, and he's very methodical when it comes to the sources that he's drawing from. So I actually have some of the books that he pulled cases from, where there's like X-rays, like the actual X-rays are given, things like that. So when you get his 2-volume work, if you're like, I want to see the actual, X-ray or the doctor's note or, whatever, he has some of that footnoted, and then you can find those. So there's a little work to do, a little digging to do. But yeah. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up there. So thank you so much, Dr. Dumsday, for spending over an hour and a half with me. I really appreciate it. And I think that the viewers did as well. And to the viewers, I really appreciate all of you watching, sticking with me. And if you enjoy this content, then there's something you can do that's completely free that would help me. And it would benefit you as well. And that is, if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe. It will help grow my channel, and the more subscribers I get, YouTube recommends it to others, so my channel begins popping up for others to view. The second thing is, if you have subscribed, then you can do something for free, and that is just share this channel on social media. Share this video, or if there's another video that you like, share those out to where they can be viewed by your friends, and that can help as well. And then if you are in a position and you feel able to do this, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. I plan to do a live stream later explaining this, but right now I'm having to work in a second job in addition to my regular teaching job, and it would be amazing, such a relief, if I could spend my time outside of my first job, my teaching job, working on these videos instead of doing that second job. So please consider supporting me on Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/CC Apologetics. And you get loads of content by doing that. Early access to videos, and lots more. Just go and check it out. I have it listed there. So we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.